Really delighted that some of you have already joined in. Obviously, we're a few minutes from starting, and we'll be back shortly, but thanks so much for joining us. Hi, this is Jeff Abramson. Really delighted so many people are already joining in. Lots of names I recognize. And we're going to have a great panel and great audience. We have a couple more minutes before we get started, but you should also be able to chat if you like, and we'll get the screen up going in a couple minutes. Thanks so much. Good afternoon to those of you who are in the same time zone as I am. Thanks so much for joining us today for this event. We're going to go ahead and get started, and I'm primarily going to be doing a little bit of introduction before turning it over to the other panelists. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Arms Control Association and also help manage something called the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is one of the hosts today, as well as the Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas, which is a relatively new network that got started last year that John and I are particularly active with, that has held a number of webinars already looking at issues primarily around gun violence in the United States and Mexico and the Northern Triangle. It's not solely the US and Central America. Today's conversation is really digging in on a topic that I think is well overlooked, if such a description is wise. A lot of us pay a great deal of attention to large arms sales. I noticed today a major arms sales notified yesterday to the Philippines, but it's much harder to understand what's going on with small arms, which the United States happens to be the world's largest exporter of, as well as the largest importer of. But there's a lot less transparency and oversight in terms of our small arms trade. The same arms trade to the Philippines, there was at least $1 million sale that was notified in December, but didn't make the Federal Register until April. And some of us still have very little detail. And the amounts in those sales are still unknown. It's a bit indicative of the challenge that we're dealing with. For the format of today's webinar, we have enabled you all to chat and chat with each other. We will be primarily paying attention to the Q&A, but we realize a lot of us have done a lot of webinars, and it's nice to be able to interact, and we are going to try as much as possible to have the three of us be done within the first half hour so that we are definitely engaging with you as an audience. We will also try as best we can to avoid jargon and acronyms, but we might fail at every now and then in that front. Let me say a little bit about what has happened in the past year. Transparency in the small arms trade has always been difficult, but last year a change occurred that enabled the semi-automatics and other weapons to be moved over from the primary control of the State Department to a list that's run by the Commerce Department. One of the upshots of that is that Congress no longer receives notification of these sales, and we as the public have a much less transparency into what's going on. This is one of the concerns that we have. John has done some research looking into this, and it looks like there's been a real spike in these arms sales, including to countries of a lot of concern to us. But this oversight and this transparency is one of the issues that we want to talk about. Our panelists today will be Brittany Benowitz, who is the Chief Counsel at the American Bar Association's Center for Human Rights, who I've had the pleasure to work with over the past decade or so in different hats that she's worn, including in Congress. But she has done some amazing work, including field work investigating human rights, especially around concerns around weapons and warfare, has been leading some work recently around proxy wars. And John Lindsay-Poland, who is a coordinator for the Project to Stop U.S. Arms to Mexico, who I haven't known quite as long, but have been able to work with much more recently, has also done some amazing work, really working with communities also in the United States as well as Mexico to understand the trafficking of weapons, both legal and illegal, and the concerns around them. With that, I'd love to turn it over to you, Brittany, first to sort of describe the process today. We are going to do some description and then circle around for a round of recommendations, although it might be difficult to not throw some recommendations in while we're describing. But if I could turn it over to you, Brittany, to give a little insight into how transparency and oversight works right now and maybe some of the concerns you have about them. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks to the Arms Control Association for holding this event on what continues to be an important policy, because we are at a point where the Biden administration is in the middle of making a decision of whether or not to continue with the more lax system of oversight of assault rifles and other small arms. And so it's important that we're having this discussion at this time. You'll often hear arms control experts talk about how small arms like weapons are the real weapons of mass destruction. I think I've seen estimates that as many as 1,000 people a day are killed with small arms. So ensuring that these weapons don't end up in the hands of terrorists, tyrants, and traffickers is really a key national security priority. To that end, the Congress has enacted a robust oversight regime, and I'm going to give a quick overview of that and how the recent changes to that oversight regime have undermined U.S. visibility into where our weapons are ending up. And it's important to understand that these are the weapons that are in the most high demand in the black market, right? Or what you'll hear people say is that small arms and spare parts are the lifeblood of the gray market. That is to say that they are the things that are produced in the United States and exported through presumably lawful means and then diverted to unlawful purposes. So these are the high demand items that, in my view, warrant the highest level of controls, but unfortunately have been moved to Commerce Department controls, which is inherently weaker. So first, let's start about talking about the difference between Commerce Department and State Department export authority. So the State Department is, by law, supposed to control the export of all military equipment that has substantial military utility. Obviously, semi-automatic assault rifles, which are the weapon of choice for militants, have substantial military utility. In contrast, the Commerce Department is supposed to control dual-use items. These are things that have civilian uses as well as military uses. These are typically less sensitive items, and they're therefore controlled by the Commerce Department. That was the understanding for decades. The Obama administration moved a lot of military equipment over to the Commerce Department, but did not move semi-automatics and other small arms, presumably understanding that these items are highly fungible, highly dangerous, and in high demand, and therefore warranted the stricter controls available under the State Department system. The Trump administration decided to go ahead and move semi-automatic assault rifles and other military firearms to Commerce Department control. So let's talk a little bit about what that does to the oversight regime. All right, so as I said earlier, the State Department exporting system, licensing system, is much, much more rigorous than the Commerce Department system. For starters, and I'm just going to list a few of the top reasons why it's stronger, but this is not by no means the definitive list. The State Department requires registration of manufacturers and brokers and licensing for each transaction. So that gives the State Department visibility of the entire supply chain, and it gives them documentation. That's critical because A, it incentivizes manufacturers to report things that go wrong, and many of the investigations have stemmed from those sorts of self-disclosures. It also gives us visibility into and the documentation necessary to build a legal case to prosecute. That's not to say that Commerce doesn't prosecute export violations, but the State Department has a lot more intel ready and available because of the higher level of information necessary to export defense articles. So the move from state transfer makes it more difficult to detect diversion to illicit networks. Secondly, the State Department system is stronger because it requires congressional notifications of the sale of small arms over $1 million. And when those notifications go to the Congress, it triggers the ability of senators to introduce a resolution of disapproval that's privileged, which means it's guaranteed a debate in the Senate. So much stronger congressional oversight and public transparency. In addition to the notifications, once the sales go through, the State Department issues an annual public report which outlines the types of weapons and which countries receive them. And that enables the public to weigh in on whether or not countries where the security forces are compromised by organized crime are getting these kinds of weapons. I have two more things I'll mention about the State Department before we move to Commerce. So the State Department is required to do a human rights assessment before they export. And for high-risk countries, they cannot export without a presidential certification to the Congress. And they also are required to do end-use monitoring. So if the weapons are misused, they have to report to the Congress, and they have to prohibit further sales if the weapons were misused by the recipient. None of these controls are in place in the Commerce Department. Moreover, even to the extent that the human rights risk assessment should have been applied to this equipment, the Commerce Department elected not to do so, right? So the Foreign Assistance Act requires that crime control equipment be subjected to the human rights risk assessment. Obviously, when you export a semi-automatic assault rifle to a foreign police unit, it's being exported for crime control purposes. It should have been designated as crime control equipment and arguably meets that definition under US law, but the Commerce Department chose not to do so, and therefore it effectively exempted itself from any binding human rights vetting. So I could go on for a long time, obviously. Let me just say that the bottom line, as a result of these regulatory changes, the US is flying blind. We do not collect the information necessary to detect diversion to terrorists and to criminal organizations. And you're going to hear John talk about a specific example of what happened prior to the transfer to the Commerce Department when the State Department, because it also was not collecting enough information, some of the weapons that they had exported ended up in the hands of a police unit in Mexico that was on the payroll of a cartel and used, we don't know if they used these particular weapons, but we're using this type of weapons in a massacre that occurred in Mexico. And the State Department never notified the Congress of this, which suggests that they were not aware, and we made them aware of this at one point, and they still failed to notify the Congress as required by law. But it just is indicative of the fact that the current system is simply not strong enough to ensure that we know when our weapons end up in the hands of bad actors. With that, I'll pause and we'll come back to the solutions later.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Great to lay out the distinctions there, and also to remember that even the system before still had a lot of concerns. So we will be talking about that as well. John, I'd love to turn it over to you now for your insights.
Thank you so much to the forum and to the Network for the Prevention of Violence in the Americas, and to everybody who's coming. It's a very painful subject because of what arms cause, and it's a complicated subject, and it can be difficult to understand all the moving parts. So how can we understand what is happening with firearms exports in general? I'm just going to show you a graph that shows for semi-automatic pistols for the last 15 years, the number of those pistols that have been exported by the United States each year. So one thing you can see is that it's been on a growing trend over time, for over more than a decade. And what you can also see is that last year it spiked. So it doubled from the year before. The regulation change occurred in March. And this same, if you just measure like the last 6 months of 2020, it's a very similar pattern of a lot more than any record of any previous year. The same thing is true for military rifles and shotguns, most of which did also transfer over to Commerce Oversight. Again, a record number of these military long guns that were exported to the rest of the world in 2020. So the issue is not just how many weapons the United States is exporting, although the number of them makes end-use controls very difficult. But in 2020, the countries that were receiving the most U.S. handgun exports were Thailand, Mexico, Tunisia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and the Philippines. In the first 4 months of this year, the top 5 buyers of U.S. pistols were Canada, Thailand, Brazil, the Philippines, and Guatemala. The top number of military rifles went to the United Arab Emirates. So how were these weapons used? Well, Thailand's military dictatorship brutally repressed massive protests last year, leading Freedom House to classify it as unfree. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates had a coalition that's been waging war in Yemen that has killed thousands of civilians. In the Philippines, there have been tens of thousands of gun-related killings, including thousands of extrajudicial murders carried out by state forces. Brazil has one of the highest rates of murder by firearm in the world. Mexico has been experiencing a serious crisis of gun homicides, forced disappearances, and extortion. Most of these violent crimes are committed directly by members of criminal organizations and other non-state actors who are getting their weapons from the illegal market. But Mexican state forces, both police and military, that receive legally imported weapons are also responsible for very serious human rights atrocities. And there is extensive documentation, as Brittany referenced, to infiltration of Mexican police forces by criminal organizations and police participation in atrocities. So I'll come back to Mexico in just a second. Why is the United States selling so many firearms to groups and places where they are being used to cause so much suffering? Guns, as Jeff referenced, and Brittany are used in hundreds of thousands of homicides every year, but gun exports really don't get as much that much scrutiny. You might expect the state and commerce departments to establish mechanisms to ensure that U.S. firearms don't end up with those who have already committed crimes. Just as within the United States, we have criminal background checks for U.S. buyers. A similar mechanism should be in place for firearms exports. Now, the U.S. issued more than 23,000 arms export licenses in the last fiscal year. The State Department has just 6 full-time staff for its end-use control program, which is known as Blue Lantern. And those staff also have other duties. So it's not surprising that these staff only found 21 unfavorable end-use cases on the basis of derogatory information or an unreliable foreign party in the last fiscal year. As a result of the transfer of oversight, these Blue Lantern checks apparently have now been terminated for assault rifles that are not fully automatic and other semi-automatic and non-automatic firearms. So they then go off that program and have even fewer eyes on them. Now, the State Department does have a watch list of suspect and sanctioned end users as an internal screening tool, but this lists only private entities, not security force, military and police units. So the relevant list of security force units and individuals in those units that may have committed human rights abuses is the International Vetting and Security Tracking Database, known as INVEST, which is used for vetting military and police assistance, not sales, but assistance. But it appears that this database is not being used to review firearms export licenses. So let's take a closer look at the case of Mexico. In late 2019, the Mexican Army sold hundreds of Sig Sauer US-produced rifles and pistols to the Tamaulipas State Police after that unit was implicated in a killing of 8 civilians in Nuevo Laredo in September of 2019. The sale proceeded even after the United Nations had announced within 2 weeks of the killings that it was investigating them, and months prior to a trial of 3 officers within that unit, which still hasn't taken place. So 12 agents from that same unit have now been charged with the murder of 19 people in January of this year, nearly all of those people young Guatemalan migrants in Camargo, Tamaulipas, right near the Texas border. And online images show those agents with Sig Sauer rifles that were imported from the United States. As in response, 8 senators wrote to the State Department about these issues in March. They asked us a series of very pointed questions. In its response in April, the State Department said that the US Embassy has not been consulted about concerns regarding Mexican police forces as end users of US exported firearms, either before or since the transfer of oversight to Commerce. Until last year, when this transfer took place, all foreign importers of US weapons had to provide an end user certificate to the exporting company, which would submit it to the US State Department. In Mexico, the Army is the sole authorized importer of firearms and also the only legal seller of firearms within the country, most of which are going to state, local, and federal police forces. The end use certificates for firearms that are exported by US companies and sold to police in Tamaulipas, which we got through a public records request in Mexico, not in the US, falsely show the end user as the Mexican military, not the Tamaulipas State Police. In fact, every single end user certificate for more than 147,000 firearms exported from the United States to Mexico for use by police from 2008 to 2019 declares the Army as the end user. But we obtained, again, through a records request in Mexico, 8,200 receipts that show the Army sold US exported weapons to police, including state and local police in Tamaulipas, in Guerrero, in Chihuahua, and other states in Mexico that have extensive documented records of state violence and corruption. The same goes for the case that Brittany was talking about of the disappeared 43 Ayotzinapa students. In February of 2015, Mexico notified Colt Manufacturing in Hartford, Connecticut, that Colt carbines would go to state police in Guerrero. On the same day, the Mexican Army submitted a certificate to the State Department for 387 Colt carbines, but named itself as the end user. A Mexican Army officer I talked with said, we're the end users. From my perspective, it's a misnomer because the end user should be who owns the weapons, but normally the importer is listed as the end user. So despite these concerns about weapons exports to Mexico, the Commerce Department issued a rule change in December with no public comment that eases firearms exports to Mexico. We're still trying to understand this rule change, but it grants to Mexico a license exception called Strategic Trade Authorization that raises Mexico's status as a trading partner in sensitive goods and might be exempting Mexico from identifying consignees for licensed firearms shipments. So this is the panoply of problems that we're facing both in this very specific case of Mexico and as more general rule around firearms exports.
Thanks so much, John. And, I know we have a number of people that are quite expert in the audience, so please do keep putting in questions. I think as you've heard from Brittany and John, there are issues in oversight and how we make these decisions, and then how we follow up and know what's happening, that are all part of why we're having this event today. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany and John for recommendations in just a second, but this issue has also got a great deal of attention within the gun violence prevention community that is working towards, banning assault weapons, when at the same time the United States is exporting many of these weapons and seemingly increasingly so. A disconnect there between domestic and foreign policy, as well as the issue of 3D gun printing, which the online publication of 3D printing plans is considered an export and had been banned by the State Department. That has now just recently moved over to the Commerce-led control at the moment. They have said that they will continue to ban the online posting of 3D gun printing plans. But just an added wrinkle of the complication when we start talking about the export of these small arms, whether they're machine guns or semi-automatics, whether they're read through the State Department or led through the Commerce Department, there's a whole lot going on, but a whole lot we don't know and a whole lot that could be improved. So Brittany, let me turn it over to you first with some of those thoughts on how to improve this, and then I'll turn it to John.
Great. Well, my list is long, but I'll try to be as quick as I can. My understanding is that as a candidate, President Biden committed to returning control over small arms exports to the State Department. The reasons I outlined before, the State Department system is simply stronger. In my personal opinion, I think the administration should do that, and that control should revert back to the State Department. Even if it does, there's still additional actions that will need to be taken to ensure that the United States has in place the intelligence capability to determine when our small arms are being diverted to unlawful purposes, which is to say we need to start taking end-use monitoring seriously. Now, the 6 dedicated people that John mentioned are not the only people within the bureaucracy that are involved in end-use monitoring. But the reality is that the end-use monitoring right now is primarily focused on going to arsenals and checking to ensure that the items are still there, or going to the warehouse to make sure that the name on the broker's license matches that address. It's not looking at whether or not the weapons are being used. It's not monitoring of operational end use. It was supposed to be, but it was never done that way. And that's not because they don't have resources. There's actually a fund that's derived from the licensing process. And there was a report from GAO a few years ago saying that the Defense Department, I think, had over $4 billion in this fund sitting around. And it's only authorized for the use of doing things like end use monitoring. So there is absolutely no reason that we don't have a robust end use monitoring system in place. It needs to be implemented. It should be a priority, not just because of small arms transports, but also because of the diversion of other weapons to terrorist and trafficking organizations around the world. At a bare minimum, in my opinion, the crime control equipment should be designated as such by the Commerce Department. It is absolutely preposterous that they can export semi-automatic assault rifles to police units and not consider that crime control equipment as required by law. So that needs to be fixed right away. And they should be requiring vetting, and they should be requiring end-use monitoring for all exports from the Commerce Department. And that should require a congressional notification in the event of an end-use violation, and it should require a prohibition on further exports when there has in fact been misuse of our equipment in the past by that security force. I also think we need to just fundamentally change the way that the Congress does oversight. Rather than passively sitting around and waiting for a license notification to come in, now that they're not getting those notifications anymore, it's important that they annually sit down, they look at the report that comes out of the State Department on exports, they look at the State Department report on human rights, and they say, okay, do these two things line up? And they look at the end-use monitoring reports and say, why are countries with poor human rights record and poor record of controlling our weapons still getting these weapons? And if you look at the old end-use monitoring reports, you'll see that the class of weapon most likely to get an unfavorable rating, which means that there was some irregularity in the supply chain that indicates diversion or misuse. It's like in Latin America for many years, it was 50% of the end-use monitoring to the region of small arms getting disfavorable ratings. Now that's not a random selection, that's targeted on high risk, but it just goes to show these are high demand, highly fungible items that need more oversight. There's a lot more that we could be done. The administration is currently reviewing the conventional arms transfer policy. The current conventional arms transfer policy does not cover crime control equipment. It should. DRL should have to certify on an annual basis whether or not a country is a consistent violator of human rights. That was the purpose of the State Department Human Rights Report. The Assistant Secretary could do that on their own initiative. And the last thing I would say is that the United States does not currently have the capacity to connect tracing data to export licenses, right? So we know, like countries in Central America, there's been studies that 15% of weapons ending up in crimes are coming from the United States and Guatemala, right? But we don't have the capacity to say, okay, well, was that as a result of ant traffic, illegal traffic from over the border, or is that a result of an export to police units who are compromised and handing stuff over to organized crime? I suspect, that both things are happening. The first one's a very hard problem to solve. The second one is a problem that could be solved, but we need to connect the dots better. And in order to do that, get more transparency about what's being exported to whom, with more detail, would enable civil society to serve as a force multiplier and help detect diversion. So that's one of the many reasons why more transparency is needed.
Thanks so much, Brittany. Just so that folks know, there was a question asked that John and I have put some answers in the Q&A, but everyone too feel free to add more questions into the Q&A. John, some of your thoughts on next steps?
Well, I would second what Brittany says. There are so many things that need to be done. There's not one thing that is going to address all of these issues because they've been building up. This is not just a Trump era problem. When Brittany talks about having controls on where the weapons are going, one of the prerequisites of that is being able to see where the weapons are going or having some information about where the weapons are going. If, like in the case of Mexico, the license information and review stuff doesn't actually name the real end users, then whatever oversight there is doesn't have the capacity to actually control what the end users or uses are. So that's one piece that, in the case of Mexico, where I've worked very closely and where there are arguably more US sourced weapons, more homicides committed with US sourced weapons than there are gun homicides in the United States, even with the spike in gun violence this year. We're saying that there should be a review of all the existing licenses for Mexico, and that they should be suspended if they do not identify, for those that are going to police, if they don't identify any end users, like if the only end user is the Army, or if they identify end users, police forces that have been credibly implicated for serious human rights abuses, which means you have a process issue where the Commerce Department and the State Department, depending on the weapon being exported, has to have a process by which they will consult the data on human rights abuses. That process is not in place right now. It was not in place even before the transfer to the Commerce Department. So we have, these layers of changes in both process as well as criteria, right? So the Leahy Law for assistance has criteria for who should not be getting assistance. I mean, that applies to state forces at least, but that's not being applied to sales. And so through legislation or through policy, that should be applied. The other thing I would say is that they're the bigger issues. So in general, Congress not being notified, but also having to respond to a notification when it comes, rather than proactively having to approve a proposed arms sale, would be an important change. That's a bigger lift in Congress, and it does require legislation, what we call flipping the script. But that's an important thing to keep on the agenda, because that's what will provide more accountability ultimately. Any measures, I think, should be moving towards that. And one of those measures is moving oversight back to the State Department, which does have the data, which does have the processes in place to implement the Leahy Law, and has statutory authorities that Brittany was talking about. And then finally, on transparency, it does say a lot about the quality of our democracy, that the Mexican military, which is known for being a very closed institution, has disclosed more about specific firearms transfers to police in Mexico and the nature of licenses to export weapons from the US than have US federal agencies that receive Freedom of Information Act requests. So for public policy and to address the serious impacts of violence committed with US sourced guns, it's important for the federal government to proactively disclose information about those transfers. And I look forward to more conversation.
Great, thanks, John and Brittany. There is a question in the Q&A if you other panelists could take a look at it and see if they want to jump in on that to some extent. But circling back quickly to the question on Congress, it's important to note that the Congress for 2 decades ago, actually, I think this was led by Dianne Feinstein, wrote into the rules that they wanted to be notified if a sale of what was then semi-automatic and automatic weapons, things in categories 1 to 3 of the what's called the U.S. munitions list, they want to be notified if the value was $1 million rather than $14 million, which is standard for other weapons, because there is a recognition that this is much, these weapons themselves don't cost as much on an individual basis. There's a different idea about these than when we talk about major large weapon systems, and the extent that they're so easily transportable, they are generally much cheaper. So you need to have a threshold that captures that. In that question there, in terms of framing this as a social justice issue, I do think you're starting to see that. I think you are starting to get a sense that, especially I would say coming from the gun violence prevention community, where there's great concern about how the use of force impacts on democracy and freedom and security, the idea that also that the things that we are exporting, if they impact on that, also becomes a social justice issue. So I think you're starting to see that. Circling quickly back to the question around congressional leaders where I started. So Dianne Feinstein, this was 20 years ago. Now we have Senator Menendez has a joint letter with a couple other senators that's in that resource page. Senator Torres introduced some legislation in the past that would revert that change. A number of others in the House have been paying attention to this, but it is a crowded agenda. So I think there are other mechanisms that we'll see being bandied about in Congress, which could be including changing how the Commerce Department notifies. So that would be a stopgap measure if you're not moving things back over to the State Department, to at least build back in that notification process. Brittany talked a bit, I'm repeating it a little bit here, about crime control being applied to things that are still at Commerce. So there are lots of measures that can be taken. And I just want to point out what I put in the chat as an example. The Philippine arms sale that came about in December was notified to Congress, but there was no public transparency around that. And then in April, when that is ending up in the Federal Register, all we have is that it was at least $1 million. So when we talk about the public transparency we need, part of it is the fact that some major weapon systems go through something called the foreign military sales process, which get notified before Congress even says, okay. Those that are happening on a different process, direct commercial sales, don't have the same level of public scrutiny and attention. So that's another change that could be really helpful. I haven't seen what the second Q&A is because I'm talking, but Brittany or John, do you want to jump in on either of these?
Well, let's see. There's several questions here that I think are really good. Terrence Witkowski asks, says that the book Blood Gun Money by Ian Grillo says the Iron River of guns to Central America and the resulting violence is a factor driving immigration to the US, but hasn't heard journalists or politicians echo this talking point. I totally concur. When Kamala Harris went to Mexico and Guatemala a week or two ago, supposedly it was about addressing the roots of violence. That was going to be part of the agenda, but instead she just said, don't come. Which is not, it is not a solution for people who are immersed in communities that are flooded with guns and have no sustainable way to keep their youth in those communities without either being recruited into a criminal organization, killed, or both. And so I do think that's a really important talking point. It's an important aspect of analysis that needs to be more in the forefront. Not because people should not be allowed in. People should be allowed in, but we should be also addressing the reasons why people are leaving. And a lot of the reasons why people are leaving have to do with this uncontrolled flow of firearms. It's not going to be a quick fix, but it needs to be addressed. And so I totally concur that those of us who are concerned about this need also to be talking with people who are working on migrant rights and who are trying to respond to the humanitarian needs of people who are fleeing, but even more with the policymakers, because and with the gun violence prevention community, because the gun violence prevention community in general has not taken up that piece of analysis, that part of what gun violence is causing.
I'll just do a quick two-finger on that. Sorry if I cut you off, Brittany. This point about the migration issue being fueled by the flow of weapons from the United States, whether that's legal or illegal, was something that came up in a congressional hearing 2 years ago that I and Susan Waltz, who I think is in the audience today, testified at. Ami Bera, who was the chair of that subcommittee at the time, made the great connection there, and some of the other members of the House did as well. I do think that this issue is one that we could hear more about. I think this is a clear reason why attention to what the United States does in terms of the export of small arms is desperately needed, because we are seeing that so vividly at the border of our country. Brittany, turning it over to you.
Yeah, I think that there is pretty strong evidence that U.S. flow of weapons to Latin America is part of the corruption that is driving migration. And I think that talking a little bit more about this Mexico case is a good illustration of that. So, obviously there's a lot of heroin trafficked into the United States that goes through southern Mexico, through Guerrero, right? And so the Guerrero's Unidos cartel had been trying for many years to capture local police, but they didn't stop there. They went to the top of the Ministry of Defense and bribed the Minister of Defense, this General Cienfuegos, who was arrested at the end of the Trump administration, but then ultimately returned to Mexico on allegations that he was accepting bribes from this heroin trafficking cartel. So there's 2 days that you can deal with this. Germany looked at the situation. They saw how bad it was. They saw how high risk it was, and they just flat out banned exports to the police in the southern states of Mexico, recognizing that the level of compromise of the security forces were so great, and the intelligence they have on that was so poor that they weren't going to be able to do meaningful vetting, and therefore any export to those police was inherently high risk. And I think that was a very practical thing to do. And as a result, there's some evidence that some of their companies that were manufacturing in Germany moved headquarters to New Hampshire because they wanted more favorable export terms, right? And when people continue to export from Mexico to those states in Guatemala, and there's a similar situation in Colombia, the German authorities prosecuted them for violating their export control laws. So it's a very sad situation when our export controls, which on the books are very strong, the enforcement is so weak that manufacturers are coming here because it makes it easier for them to export to a department in Mexico where the local police have been captured by drug trafficking organizations. And we know this because they prosecuted some of the members of the cartel in Chicago, and they got wiretaps on their phones, and they have intercepts of the members of the cartel telling the police what to do the day of the disappearance of 43 Ayotzinapa students. So it's mind-boggling to think that it has such clear national security implications for the United States, whether you care about illegal migration or narcotics trafficking. It doesn't matter. It has profound implications for the United States. You would think that we would dedicate the resources necessary to really understand who's getting our weapons and how and why, and mandating that, for example, the Mexican army, by law, under US law, they are not authorized to retransfer our weapons to the police without prior permission of the United States. So if that is in fact what happened, as John outlined, then again, that's a violation of those end-use agreements, and that should be investigated.
John, you've also looked into this issue of companies setting up shop here in the United States. You want to briefly touch on that too? I remember now that we had this in the description of the event, and I wanted to bring that up, but we haven't at this point.
Okay, so I'll say something about that, and also I want to respond to this question about the connections with Lisa Jordan's question about good guys versus bad guys, and how we understand who are the quote bad guys. The companies there was a lot of strong European firearm companies, Beretta, Sig Sauer. There's a number of them that have set up shop in the United States, and a lot of it is because there's a huge retail market here. There's a huge civilian commercial market here, so that is part of it. The United States, with 4% of the world's population, has more than 40% of the firearms in civilian hands in the world. So that is part of it. But the other part is definitely the export from here, and especially compared to Germany, but Europe in general. There's something called the European Common Position around weapons exports in Europe that is increasingly scrutinizing and exercising some controls over where weapons are being exported in the world. So some of the companies are seeing that, as well as the kind of prosecution that happened in Germany around this case with Ayotzinapa, as well as Sig Sauer's exports to Colombia. And from the US, there's really no problem. But here is where I would like to turn to the question around who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, and Lisa framed this in terms of Black Lives Matter, because I think that basically a lot of the people in the US government, they don't care. They don't really, because the lives of people who are being impacted are not visible and they're not important. Okay, so Brittany, Jeff, and I, we're not in the impacted countries. We're not being directly impacted by those weapons exports. And so they're not, it's not necessarily hearing about it, but also I think there's a culture of like, well, that's just not as important. So, and I think that is the same dynamic that is operating in this country, the racist dynamic in this country that has brought about the Black Lives Matter movement in order to address police violence against Black people in this country. Because this, in my mind, it's the same ethic or lack of ethic that basically says, well, those people south of the border, they're kind of violent anyway, right? It's not about the weapons that we export. And even the word tyrants, I would take, like the idea that somehow if the US knew, like if the US only enforced its laws, or if it, I think the US is complicit. That's part of what is happening here. And the US is a party to what is going on. And so when we use the vocabulary of tyrants, we sort of imagine dictators. Mexico is not a dictatorship. It just has elections every 6 years and just had legislative elections. And so that kind of language sort of calls to mind something that's other. And these are nations and governments and communities that are not other. And we have a lot in common with them. So I don't know, that's kind of a rant, but I do think that we need to understand that there's a huge ethical component of this, that it can't just be fixed technically. It has to be addressed directly.
Thanks so much, John and Brittany. Obviously, there's a whole range of opinions on this, I think, including in the audience here. But I hope you're all getting a feel for some of the concerns. I'm going to do something a little bit odd here, but if anybody would like to take the floor, maybe this is a crazy idea, but the audience we're just 45 of us right now. If anybody would like to raise their hand to speak and ask a question verbally, I'm happy to allow that. Otherwise, I will kind of move us sort of towards wrapping up, but I'd be happy to take, someone wanted to add in a question. Feel free to raise your hand. Okay, no problem. Brittany or John, I guess as we sort of turn to wrapping up here, I wanted to flag that I will share afterwards, and I put in the chat, I think I put in the chat, the resource page that the Forum on the Arms Trade has on this, which details a number of years specifically around the change of export oversight from State Department to Commerce Department. I think it's important to know that state is still involved in the oversight, but it's really Commerce has the lead now in that, which includes many sign-on letters from more than 100 organizations who have been active on flagging this is a real concern. So I want to make sure you see that resource as well. John or Brittany, is there any other topics you would like to jump in here or questions? We had some others from the audience ahead of time asking, but I think we've tackled some of those. So any final thoughts?
One of the questions that came in beforehand was, what are the implications of the Geneva Conventions for all this? And so I will get into that because it relates back to John's point that he just made, which is, at what point does the United States have responsibility for continuing to export in a manner that's highly reckless? And the answer is that under Common Article 1 of the Geneva Conventions, the United States has a duty to ensure respect for the conventions. So in countries that are in a state of armed conflict, the United States should not be exporting weapons where it's likely and foreseeable that they'll be used in the commission of violations of the conventions. And there's in outside the context of armed conflict and in the context of a normal law enforcement, such as in Latin America, there's similar obligations under human rights law, that there's a duty to protect and prevent abuses. And so the bottom line is that if you know that your system has inadequate controls to prevent the use of your weapons to be used in human rights violations, you have an obligation to do more. And I do think that that is the state of play currently in the United States. And I think John is absolutely right that it won't change until we humanize those people who are the victims of all this, and the folks in these countries who don't necessarily have the capacity to form political parties and petition for the redress of grievances and deal with it at home. So I think it is incumbent upon us in the United States to demand accountability from our own government and advocate for a stronger system.
Thanks so much, Brittany. John?
Well, there was a question about whether we are optimistic about the new administration, the Biden administration. I think there was some optimism, especially when, as candidate, Joe Biden promised to move firearm export oversight back to the State Department, which was a call from many different organizations, including in the gun violence prevention community. I feel some of that optimism fading because while gun violence prevention has been a top level issue for this administration, it doesn't appear to include any kind of cross-border or export component. And I think one of the things that happens is that this issue falls between domestic and foreign policy, right? So if you talk about gun violence prevention or control in federal policy circles, a lot of times people will say, well, that's a Department of Justice issue, or that's an ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms issue, or that's a health and human services issue, rather than it being a foreign policy issue. And in this case, it's true even more about the illegal trafficking, that it crosses this domestic foreign policy divide. But I would say the same is true for the exports as well, is that it just doesn't, and it's also not part of migration policy, right? It's not being included as part of that. So I think we just have a lot of work to do in order to help further that holistic analysis and bring it to senators who are allies. I mean, Gary Cosette had said, so who are they? Who are the allies in Congress? And keep at them, because as you said, there's a lot of things to compete with. I just want to, in the spirit of humanizing, just show who are some of the people we're talking about. So these are some of the people who were murdered by a state police special forces unit in Tamaulipas, Mexico. Tamaulipas is right over the border from the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And these were migrants who had left about a week before from Guatemala, from the highlands, from very, very, very poor communities, and were ambushed by this state unit, which was armed with 6-hour assault rifles that had been legally exported. They were shot, and then they were burned, and the vehicle, their bodies were piled in a vehicle which was left on the road. And there are state police agents who are charged with this crime, but that unit is still armed with 6-hour rifles. And so the lack of any kind of controls as well as eyes, as well as just kind of accountability for the impacts of these things is so central. And I just think, I hope that it moves us to keep working for the policy changes that can prevent these things in the future.
Thanks so much, John, for humanizing this also. I feel sort of odd going back to Vincent Campos's somewhat technical question after the human side here, but maybe I'll spend a quick minute on it and see if John or Brittany want to add in. But Vincent asked if there's possible regulatory remedy to increase responsibilities and authorities by Commerce, if end-use monitoring statutes need revising, and how significant is the gun lobby. I'm not going to talk about the gun lobby, but I think we've covered a lot of these, but I'll just flag some of the ones. My preference is that this goes back over to the State Department, where I would also like to see the State Department use its authority to raise the profile of human rights. So not moving it over itself isn't going to be enough in my mind. But if things were to stay at the Commerce Department, I think immediately we need to get notifications. We need to apply the notifications that had applied to the weapons that when they were on the U.S. munitions list that moved over to the Commerce list. That level of notification should occur. I think it would be even better if that were public rather than solely to Congress. Brittany, I think, flagged, was talking a little bit about crime control. Does crime control, I'm trying to think what the right term is. It's not a measure. It's a crime control screen. Needs a commitment to apply that to the licensing of these weapons that are now under the Commerce Department. Will be a couple of the regulatory things that would be a stopgap. But I'll stop there and see if John or Brittany want to tackle this question in more depth.
Just a few quick thoughts. So there are things that can be done at the regulatory level to improve controls at Commerce, but they cannot by regulation create a system as strong as the system that exists for the State Department. So it's conceivable that you could prohibit further deliveries on an authorized sale after evidence of an end-use violation emerges through regulations as exists for the State Department, but it's going to be subject to legal challenge because it doesn't have a statutory framework underpinning it. So it's far, far better to return these items to the State Department. That said, yes, adding the crime control screen by regulation would help. It would also help to change the annual report the BIS issues, which currently only reports on exports for the top 20 so-called high-risk countries, which are not the ones that are primarily of concern for this issue. And so that annual report can be expanded right now to include all recipients, especially for these weapons. So there are a number of things that could be done. The other thing that's really important is that, I think we've talked about this briefly, but I'll go into a little more detail. So when the change happened, the Bureau of International Security at Commerce didn't have any personnel in Latin America. So it had no Latin America expertise for doing this end-use monitoring. And the State Department has security personnel in every embassy, in every country where they have an embassy all around the world, who not only have the expertise about the weapons, but they also have relationships with local law enforcement, because the United States provides significant assistance and grants to local law enforcement to train them and to work with them closely. So fundamentally, you need an interagency strategy for utilizing and leveraging those relationships in order to get the intelligence you need in order to ensure that these weapons are not handing up in the hands of people who are misusing them.
Yeah, I would concur with Brittany on that. The Biden administration can move oversight back to state without legislation. That is how Trump got oversight from state to Commerce. It might be a somewhat heavier lift. So saying, okay, what are the regulatory changes we can make in Commerce? I would concur, like, whatever can be done should be done. But it kind of begs the question, what political will does the Biden administration have? Is this getting the attention of Gina Raimundo? I don't know. We've asked for meetings with Commerce, haven't gotten meetings with Commerce, with the Bureau of Industrial Security. And even as it remains in Commerce, there are a lot of problems. The question from Gary Cosette, why not pull out a full court press to get Biden to move control from state back to from Commerce back to state, and try and get Democrats to push him on that. Is it a top priority? But I have to say that there were so many problems under the State Department oversight that we're also kind of looking to see, okay, well, whether it's under state or under commerce, you have to address these problems, because the simple matter of moving it back to the state doesn't address some of the underlying problems. So the both are very needed, in my view.
I think that's a good stopping point. When John and Brittany and I talked beforehand, we said we wanted to try to not get too weedy or too technical, and I think we've done the best we can on that. But this is some of the solutions or partial fixes really do require real digging into the weeds. I think we've hopefully done both. We've got in the weeds. We've also tried to keep this at a human level and an understandable level. I want to thank John and Brittany very much for agreeing to do this. This has been recorded. It's actually being live streamed right now, and that will live on. It's on the forum's website, but it'll be available on YouTube from now on. As we close, you will get an option to do a little survey to tell us how this went, if there are things you like, things you would like to see improved. So I do encourage you to please help us out by giving us some feedback, and we'll be doing more on this topic and always welcome your thoughts and suggestions. Thanks so much on behalf of the Forum on the Arms Trade and the Network to Prevent Gun Violence in the Americas.